The Las Vegas Grand Prix produced an incredibly interesting race from start to finish. We saw a 4-time world champion being crowned. We saw a 7-time world champion showing that he still has a shelf life. We saw continued head scratching from Mercedes after an absolutely dominant performance. And we saw a disheveled Leclerc and Ferrari. Vegas is 2 for 2 on brilliant races, so let's get into everything about that race and more. Hello everybody, my name is Michael and welcome back to Last to First. We have to start out by saying a huge congratulations to Max Verstappen after being crowned the world champion of 2024 and his 4th title in a row, which is pretty bonkers to say. Who would have thought that he would have gone on to win 4 in a row after 2021? But yes, very impressive year from him, and he is well deserving of it. It is an absolutely huge accomplishment to him, and in general, just only a few select drivers have managed to win that many championships. Crazy enough. It's interesting that Red Bull has produced 2 4-time world champions, all having them back to back, which is really interesting between him and Vettel. So huge congrats to him. A really amazing championship bid this year. Now, Verstappen isn't one to show much emotion other than anger at times, but you can tell it really meant a lot to him this time out. He was kind of in a bit of tears over the radio on the cooldown lap after being announced as the champion, and it just shows how much that really meant to him this year. I think he's had to fight for it a lot, and I think it's probably got to be his most well-deserved championship, because while he did start out dominantly at the beginning of the year, the majority of the season he didn't necessarily have the fastest car. He was winning races that maybe he shouldn't have won, that maybe McLaren could have taken more advantage of, and then he had different high points like in Brazil, where he showed that he can put together an absolute masterclass in tough circumstances, and he had points in Vegas that shows that he can be smart and just get the points when he needs, and all of that comes together to form another world championship. Now, while he did show that he has some weaknesses like his low point in Mexico, he overall is quite bulletproof and is extremely deserving of the championship this year. He continues to impress year in and year out, race after race, and who knows what he is going to continue to accomplish in the future. And while he might not be in Formula One for a very long time, by the sounds of things, he is going to make a big impact in his time in Formula One. Now, 2025 is shaping up to be a very interesting season. I have no doubt that Red Bull and Verstappen will be fighting for the championship again, but I think there's every possibility that teams like Ferrari and McLaren will be fighting for it. So will Verstappen be able to get 5 in a row? I think it's a very real possibility, but I think it is going to be a much harder challenge for him, and that would be very, very impressive if he manages to pull that off. Ultimately, we'll get onto it a bit more later, but Red Bull need to figure out their driver situation, because Verstappen just needs somebody else to help him with the championship. He's won this championship single-handedly and kept them in the Constructors Championship single-handedly, and they will almost certainly lose the Constructors again next year if they don't do something with that second driver, because it is in a really, really bad spot right now. But I think all of that just makes for an even more impressive Verstappen championship season, because he has done it realistically all on his own. Red Bull certainly has some issues to iron out, both with its driver situation and with its car ahead of 2025, but I have no doubt that they will make some good improvements and will be fighting for a championship again next year. Now that we've talked about the biggest accomplishment of the season and the main point of the whole season, let's get into some of the other outstanding features of the race. And first, let's talk about Lewis Hamilton and how his mistakes really cost him the win today. Hamilton certainly showed that he still has it. He was very impressive all weekend, and Mercedes in general was so surprisingly good throughout the entire weekend. They topped every single session of the weekend, which was insane, but he produced an absolutely phenomenal drive, and he nearly won it, even though he was coming from 10th on the grid. He had tremendous speed in qualifying, probably should have been on pole, and then he very could have won the race had he started a little higher up the grid, but his mistakes in qualifying cost him to be starting 10th on the grid, and I think he probably would have won if he started any higher because of the race pace that he was showing. I mean, at one point he was lapping 7/10 on average, 7/10 of a second, than Russell was, even though he was on a bit older tires. So it was wildly impressive. That last stint and really the race in general showed that Hamilton certainly has what it takes. There was a lot of what ifs in that race for Hamilton. Like, of course, if he had qualified better, then I think the result would have been a lot different. But there's also what ifs about if Hamilton managed to get past the McLarens and the RB earlier in the first stint, and if he was able to get past the Ferraris faster in the second, then he wouldn't have been down at 12 seconds in the final stint, and there could have been a higher likelihood of him bringing home the win. But all of those what ifs are kind of the problem with Hamilton in this season, is that he really hasn't been able to string together a full weekend in just about forever, it feels. The two big mistakes that he made in qualifying were detrimental to him winning the race, and he had two opportunities to put together a decent lap, and he messed up on both of those cases, and that really cost him the win. No matter how good he was throughout the rest of the weekend and in the race, we can't forget that he did have those big mistakes, and that really cost him the win. Had he been able to string that together a little better, then I think we'd be looking differently on this weekend for him. Now, while a lot of the praise has been going towards Lewis Hamilton, and I think rightfully so, because he had such a strong race and weekend, particularly with how weak he's been performing lately, we have to give props to Russell, because he had an absolutely flawless weekend and race, and yet it still feels like he is being overshadowed by Hamilton a little bit, which is unfortunate for him. I mean, Hamilton in the race showed that he was the better driver of the two on pure pace, and he was shaping up to be that way and qualifying, which has not always been the case this year. But once again, Russell was the one putting it together and getting the result. Like in Austria, Russell was the one in the picture to take advantage of the carnage at the front, and here today, Russell was in the position to take advantage of the car that they had, and he brought home a really dominant win. This ended up being Russell's best winning margin. I know he's only had a couple races, but with his other two wins, he's only been ahead by a couple seconds at the end, and this time he was comfortable the entire race, and he was still well over 5 seconds clear of Hamilton at the end, despite the late charge from Hamilton. Russell can be a bit of a funny case, because sometimes he's really mistake prone and he's crashing, and there's been plenty of times where I have given him a lot of flack for those mistakes, but then there's other times where he's absolutely flawless, like this weekend. He shows incredible pace, consistency, and shows that he can be the team leader that Mercedes needs him to be, but he just needs to maintain these performances more consistently. Of course, some of the negative aspects of Russell's year this year, I think we do have to put part of the problem to the edginess of the Mercedes car that they have given to both Hamilton and Russell, because both drivers have had a lot of mistakes and crashes, and they really have had some difficulties throughout the year. Of course, generally, Russell has been the better one to handle those things, but I think all of these issues definitely highlight the problems with the car. But nonetheless, when it came together, Russell was the one to be able to take advantage of it this weekend, and Hamilton was making the mistakes that cost him the win. It was good for him to still crawl back to second for a really dominant Mercedes 1-2, which who would have predicted that at the beginning of the weekend? But yeah, Russell was the one to take advantage of it, and we can't let that be overshadowed by Hamilton's great race. Just behind the Mercedes pair wound up being the Ferrari pair, and Ferrari was really looking to be the favorites of the weekend. Even throughout the first couple practice sessions of the weekend, it looked like Mercedes had the one lap pace, but Ferrari was going to be ahead by a pretty decent margin when it came to race pace, and that didn't end up being the case. They were just behind Mercedes for the race and qualifying, and Mercedes was just the cream of the crop this weekend somehow. But Ferrari in the race, they were kind of looking like the Ferrari of old. I mean, they had decent pace, but they were indecisive and they made some mistakes. They needed 2 laps to give Sainz an answer whether it was going to be a two-stop or not. They were indecisive on switching the drivers, and it almost lost out an extra position to Hamilton, even though it was futile at the end because Hamilton did get past them. But they were still, I felt, very indecisive on that. And then, of course, they called Sainz in and told him not to come in at the very last minute because they weren't ready. So that just feels like the Ferrari of old. But can we talk about why that wasn't a penalty? It's been the case for a very long time since, what was it, 2018 Germany, when Mercedes and Hamilton crossed the pit entry or exit, that you'll get a penalty for that. And Sainz very clearly crossed the pit entry, and there was not even an investigation or anything. So it was very strange that he didn't get a penalty or anything for that, but I guess they got away with that, and they hurt their race more anyways, because Sainz lost about 4 seconds on that lap doing that. But yeah, Ferrari was just not looking at the top of their game this weekend, even though they have been looking pretty good for, at least operationally, for the other bits of the season. It wasn't broadcasted, but Leclerc went on an absolute rant of all rants after the race. After the first stint, Sainz was supposed to hold position according to Leclerc, and then Sainz passed him. Leclerc told his race engineer to try speaking to him in Spanish next time, which was pretty hilarious. Leclerc was feeling pretty spicy, and then he, at the end of the race, he went on to another rant, dropping F-bombs about him always being nice and respectful, and that this always happens all the time, and he just continued ranting about it, didn't realize that his radio was still on, and Fred Vasseur actually had to get on the radio to tell him to stop. So Leclerc was not particularly happy after that race. I'd be curious to know what exactly was agreed upon before the race to make him so fired up by that. But yeah, I don't blame him for being mad, and I don't blame Sainz for maybe breaking some of the rules, because the team is kicking him out for next season. So we'll see what comes out of that in the future, but it was very interesting to see. I think there must have been something not clearly communicated properly to Leclerc and or Sainz, and it shows a lot of tension building for Leclerc and Ferrari, which we've seen a little bit of it throughout this season, and it makes me incredibly intrigued for next year to see how Hamilton is going to slot into that team. This has been Leclerc's team for quite some time when he grabbed it from Vettel's hands, but if there are cracks like this that are starting to show a little bit, and if they continue to fester throughout Ferrari, Hamilton might be able to slip in and steal the team for him, especially if he starts having performances consistently that are beating Leclerc. So, I mean, that driver pairing has always been a matchup to look out for next year, but I think with some of these little cracks starting to show, it's going to be even more intriguing to see what happens next year. Now we move on to McLaren, and I think it was really just a weekend of acceptance for them. Norris was very open over the weekend about accepting that the title fight was over after Brazil. I think he looked a little bit dejected over it, which is understandable because he was thinking that he was fighting for a title, and I thought that he might be a little dejected over it and a little low energy. And I'm sure the stress has been a lot for him. He'll be looking forward to having some time to rest over the winter break to make a new charge in 2025. But Lando, he just recognized that Verstappen was the better driver all year and that he deserved the title. And I think there was some weight that would have been lifted off him and McLaren after that. But I think it was just a weekend of reflection for them and realizing, like, okay, the title is definitely over now. What comes next? And that is continuing to fight for the Constructors Championship and really preparing a good charge for the title for 2025. Even Zach Brown managed to congratulate Verstappen and tell him the championship was well deserved, but I thought it was pretty funny to hear some banter between them two when Verstappen throws some absolute shade at Zach Brown, saying that he can only win in the fastest car, so that was pretty hilarious. But I think even Zach Brown would have to admit that it was a really strong season from Verstappen, and McLaren didn't deserve to win the Drivers' Championship this year. McLaren have been a bit underwhelming over the past couple races. Really, I think since they put on that new floor upgrade that they waited so long for. They were waiting for so long to put that floor upgrade on because they wanted to make sure that it worked, but I feel that it hasn't fully jumped them up the grid a little more as much as maybe I thought that it would and that they thought it would. And I think it really just shows with this era of cars that even the teams with the seemingly best understanding of the rules can still fall back a bit if something is slightly not working right. And I think that's what we've seen a little bit. I mean, I didn't expect this track to suit the McLaren particularly well. I think they will be fighting right at the front again next time out in Qatar. That should suit their car a little bit, but they haven't been doing so well as of late. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they bounce back from it. We did see, of course, McLaren or Red Bull this year see some of those challenges with the upgrades on a more dramatic scale because they were so dominant. And now we've seen it a bit with McLaren, just a bit less so. But yeah, these rules are just so tricky, and just small differences seem to be making an impact on the running order. It feels like the field has really converged on the ceiling of these regs because because even massive upgrades aren't making a massive difference, and it's not leapfrogging competitors ahead of each other. And yeah, everything just seems so tight, especially with Gasly and the Alpine qualifying a legitimate P3, which was pretty insane. But yeah, it's interesting to see the field convergence here. A quick note on Piastri as well. He just had another plain Jane race. He was behind Norris again. He was behind him all weekend, and he got a 5-second penalty for being out of his starting grid position, which was a stupid mistake. But he needs to bounce back in the last races of the season, and he's just been not super impressive lately. I'm not sure what's going on, but maybe McLaren just needs a reset overall in the winter break so that they can start a new charge next year. I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but let's talk about the Mercedes and the pace they had this weekend. I mean, it was the best car by an absolute mile. It was so shocking. My predictions for the weekend did not include an absolute masterclass from Mercedes. It was just absolutely bonkers. I mean, they don't even know why they were so fast. Nobody really knows why they were so fast. They just are up and down, and their performances continue to baffle them and everybody else. I know that I guess they do better in cooler conditions, but I don't think anybody would have expected them to be this strong out. They not only had the best one-lap pace and the best race pace, but they were able to fire up their tires quickly and still be very kind to them. Ferrari fell off an absolute cliff on the medium, and the Mercedes held on and were doing just fine. Hamilton was able to push up until the end of both tire compounds, and they just looked to be the best car overall. And it shows that when the two of those drivers have a car that's working as they would like, then they're on fire and can perform at the highest level. Mercedes really seems to either be winning the races and getting some 1-2s here and there, or they're absolutely nowhere, and it seems like they're nowhere in between, which is pretty crazy. It just goes to show their up and down nature of this season and really them in general in these regulations. But now, next time out in Qatar, I fully expect them to be the fourth fastest team. I mean, I thought that this past weekend, and that went really well for me, but I think there's a more higher likelihood that they will be the fourth fastest team next time out. While it is nice that they had such a good result, they really need to get on top of understanding what is going on if they have any hope of fighting consistently at the front in 2025 and beyond, because this inconsistency has really hurt them, and it's made them not be anywhere near the fight for the constructors nor the drivers' championship. Another talking point of the race that continues to be a talking point week in and week out is Perez and the Red Bull driver situation, and there's supposedly going to be a meeting between the shareholders and Red Bull after Abu Dhabi to discuss the driver situation, and that's a good thing because something has to be done. Perez is absolutely nowhere. Like, this is the worst of the worst in his time at Red Bull. He is absolute miles behind, and he might be my vote for the worst driver of the season. I mean, he's not too far off Logan Sargent, and Logan Sargent only had half a season to show how not good he was, but he is so miles behind in the championship. He has single-handedly cost Red Bull the Constructors' Championship. He can barely make it out of Q1 most weekends, and most times he doesn't make it out of Q1, and then he's lucky to score even a single point. So they need to do something about Perez, but the problem is Lawson had a bit of a shocker this weekend. He did manage to beat Perez in qualifying, but his race was quite poor, finishing 16th, while Tsunoda scored some points. He has shown some great promise, but there's also been some signs that maybe he's not quite ready for Red Bull. Of course, Yuki is generally doing a good job, but Red Bull clearly just don't want him in the car, and I think he really consistently shows why he doesn't belong in Red Bull, whether it's running into the pylon at the pit exit or having rough weekends like Mexico. I'm not so convinced that Yuki Tsunoda will ever be ready to be at the level of Red Bull. But is Perez really any better than Lawson or Tsunoda? I think that is probably not the case with the performance that he's giving. At least Lawson might have a higher ceiling than Perez, and it's got to be worth a shot to put him in the car. I mean, they could definitely give Yuki Tsunoda a shot. I don't think they should. I think Tsunoda is very overrated, and I think he would absolutely crumble with the pressure at Red Bull, but I guess they should try anything and everything because the Perez situation is definitely not working by any means. Now, the other option for them that has snuck up in recent times is Franco Colapinto, but he's quickly crashing himself out of contention with a lot of cracks in his armor showing that he might not be able to make another big step up either. He had a disastrous weekend in Brazil and a completely unnecessary crash in qualifying, and it's shown that he makes a bit too many mistakes, and he is costing Williams dearly in damages. It has cost a lot for Williams to fix all the mistakes lately, and while it certainly was the right call to swap Franco Colapinto in for Sargent, I mean, he's crashing just as much as Logan Sargent was at this point. It's an absolute miracle Williams has enough money or parts to keep both cars going at this point with the cost cap, and yeah, I think it's a little worrying times for Williams because I wonder how all of this will impact their 2025 season because they're surely going to have to divert resources for development to just getting two cars on the grid. But yeah, with all that said, Franco Colapinto still in with a shot. I would be shocked if they threw him in the Red Bull over Lawson because Lawson is in their driver pool, but Red Bull has done crazier things, so I wouldn't be at all surprised. But nonetheless, Red Bull need to do something about the Perez situation. So let's get on to my predictions versus the actual results of the weekend. And my goodness, I feel like I'm wrong every weekend, but this was a brutal weekend for me this time out. So let's get into qualifying. Starting out in P5, I thought it would be Esteban Ocon, and it wound up being Max Verstappen. And I should have known that it would have been Gasly getting the better performance instead of Ocon because the two of them just go back and forth. One has a good weekend, the other one does poorly, then the other one has a good weekend, and the other one does poorly. So really, I should have known that it would be Gasly getting the better result, but I was right that an Alpine would be in the top 5. Now moving on to P4, I had Carlos Sainz, and it actually wound up being Charles Leclerc. P3, I thought it would be Lando Norris, who neither McLaren managed to be in the top 5, crazy enough, in qualifying, and it wound up being Pierre Gasly, which was quite the lap to put him up there. P2, I had Leclerc, and it wound up being Carlos Sainz, which I mentioned it in my predictions. I really should have just went for Sainz over this weekend because he does do well in these low grip scenarios, and he had a pretty good weekend overall. P1, I predicted that it would be Max Verstappen, and it wound up being George Russell because Mercedes were just god tier this weekend somehow, and yeah, nobody expected that. But Verstappen and Red Bull kind of struggled a little bit because they had a higher downforce rear wing because they do not have a super skinny one that they just never made throughout the season. I guess they didn't feel that they needed it for just a couple of outlier tracks, and they paid the price for it this weekend by being pretty slow on the straights. So moving on to the race, starting out in P5, I thought it would be Oscar Piastri, and neither McLaren wound up in the top 5 of the race either, crazy enough, and it wound up being Max Verstappen in P5, which was just enough, finishing ahead of Russell to claim his 4th title. P4, I thought it would be Lando Norris, and it was Charles Leclerc, which I was quite surprised by that result from him and Ferrari. But yeah, I thought the McLarens would be a bit on the back foot this weekend, but I didn't expect them to be quite so far behind. But mostly that's because the Mercedes were way ahead of what I thought that they would be. I guess had it not been for Mercedes doing so well, then McLaren would have fit in right about where I thought that they would. But nonetheless, they were outside of the top 5 in the race. First podium spot of the race, P3, I had Carlos Sainz, and it wound up being Carlos Sainz, sneaking in a nice little podium for himself. P2, I had Verstappen, and it wound up being Lewis Hamilton, coming onto the podium from 10th. P1, I thought it would be Leclerc, and it wound up being George Russell for a Mercedes 1-2, which was shocking. I thought Ferrari was going to have this one in the bag, and Mercedes ended up being the one to have this in the bag. For my masterclass of the weekend, I had doubled down on Esteban Ocon, and once again, I should have known that it would have been Gasly, given that they do the opposite of each other week in and week out. And Gasly had a really great performance, qualifying P3, having a really shocking result there. And he was on for good points until his engine blew up. I think it's just so fitting for what Renault and Alpine are. With the field as reliable as it is now, of course, it would be a Renault engine to blow up. Now, this is my best prediction yet. For my disaster class of the weekend, I had Mercedes, and it's absolutely shocking how far I was off on this prediction. They literally led every single session and got a 1-2 in the race. And yeah, it was complete opposite to what I thought was going to happen. I thought they were going to be quite a ways off, and instead they were by far the superior car of the weekend. I should have known to some degree that they would be okay since they do well in cold temperatures, but I don't think anybody would have predicted them to have the absolute dominant weekend that they did. And with the way that they are up and down, they'll almost certainly be the fourth fastest again next weekend. But wow, they were absolutely phenomenal this weekend. For my bold prediction, I had Lance Stroll in the points, and he was nowhere close. He was having radio issues for the whole race, which certainly didn't help him any, but Aston was just on the outskirts of the points. Fernando had a P11, so it was close, but Stroll really had no pace. Aston probably would have been a bit further down the order had Gasly and Albon not retired, but yeah, Aston is just not really in the picture right now, and Stroll didn't do himself any favors during the race, and the radio certainly didn't help him either. My overtake of the race has got to be Perez's move on Lawson and Magnussen. That was a really fun double pass on the two of them, and Lawson certainly did not expect that move, and it's a miracle that all three cars fit into that corner. I could see that when when Lawson was defending the move from Magnussen, he was pushing him out a little bit, and next thing you know, Perez comes up the inside, and he had to not take evasive maneuvers, but he had to be very careful not to run into either of them. And it's actually shocking how well behaved all of the drivers were in that scenario and just throughout the race in general, especially in that case because there could have very easily been contact. That was a tight corner to go 3 deep into, and yeah, it was just really impressive racing and a really cool overtake and a cool battle to see. It's crazy Perez can barely manage to score a point, but at least he made a nice move of the race. Another shout out is just generally Lawson and Magnussen's battle. They were kind of battling out throughout the race, and at the beginning and the end of the race, their battles were really spectacular. I couldn't believe that they didn't make any significant contact. They did bang wheels a little bit, but it was really awesome and fierce but fair racing, and that's just the type of stuff that we want to see in Formula One. It was really great. So let's take a look at the championship picture, and of course Verstappen officially sealed his 4th title in a row, and the 5th one in a row is going to be looking quite the challenge, but it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I think it played out a little longer than maybe we had thought, and yeah, congrats to him. It was a well-deserved title this year. Very challenging year for him to kind of fight back when he didn't have the fastest car over the year. And I think with how close that it ended up being after the beginning of the year and after last year, I think everybody would have been very happy with that because I think it was a foregone conclusion, even going back to last year, that he was going to win this year's title. And it ended up being more interesting than anybody thought. So we talked, of course, on Perez and how far down he is in the championship and how poorly he has been performing. But when I looked at the championship table, it is more shocking than I could have imagined. Perez is 251 points behind Verstappen. How is that acceptable? I really don't have any words for that. Taking a look at second in the championship, Leclerc is 21 points behind Norris, so he is still making some inroads, but it's looking like it's going to be a bit of a challenge for Leclerc to pull out P2 in the championship, especially when I think McLaren is going to be the favorites next weekend. But yeah, still an interesting battle to be had there. Bottas is still behind Logan Sargent in the championship, believe it or not, with Sauber still not scoring a single point. Ferrari did make some inroads into McLaren. They are 24 points behind them, but I think this was supposed to be a big opportunity for Ferrari as they were looking to be the favorites ahead of the weekend. They, of course, did score some points on McLaren, but I don't think it was as many as they would have been hoping for, considering the gap and considering that Qatar should suit the McLaren significantly more than Ferrari. So I would imagine that gap to grow a little bit in McLaren's favor next time out. It's pretty crazy looking at the constructor standings, how Formula One in general is the closest field spread that I think it's ever been, but there is still a significant difference between the top 4 teams and the rest of the teams. There's over a 300-point gap between Mercedes and Aston Martin, and it just shows that there's still a long ways to go for those other 6 teams to be catching up to the front runners. This race also saw Haas getting back ahead of Alpine by 1 point in the constructors after Gasly had that unfortunate DNF and Hülkenberg got a P8. RB are only 3 points behind Alpine, so all of that battle is very much still up for grabs. And even Sauber looked half decent throughout the race, and it was looking like there was a chance for them to score 1 point, but all of that fell away at the end, and they are still pointless for the season. So that was my race rundown for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. It was a really brilliant and interesting race to start off the final 3 races of the season, and just like that, we are moving on to Qatar in 1 week's time, where we should see the McLarens back at the top, but it will be very close across the grid. So thank you all for tuning in. If you are interested, please give me a like and a subscribe. Also follow me on social media. I'm on X as Last to First Real, first spelled F1RST, also on Instagram as Last to First. You can follow me on all the major podcast platforms as Last to First, and also, of course, on YouTube as Last to First. Once again, first spelled F1RST. So thank you all for tuning in to my race rundown, and I'll see you all next time out for the Qatar Grand Prix.